father took me and my little sister down to the river that first frozen year, saying he wanted us to walk on the water. I recall my trepidation and exhilaration at stepping onto the dangerous Ohio, transformed into a crystal sheet beneath my boots. And I recall the gift my father gave me that day, the courage that comes from meeting a natural entity that could swallow you up, but chooses instead to hold you. I did not know then that this was a storied river with a history of bearing enslaved Black people to freedom. The tragic and highly publicized story and legal case of Margaret Garner, a woman seeking liberty in the 1850s, had been famous in the 19th century. It had, however, faded from public consciousness until Toni Morrison used it as inspiration for her stunning novel, Beloved. Margaret Garner had been born an enslaved girl in Kentucky near the Ohio River. Like the formerly enslaved writer Harriet Jacobs, she experienced sexual predation in her teenage years. The man who owned Margaret, Archibald Gaines, took advantage of her vulnerability and his power. By the time she was 22, Margaret had 4 children. She had been permitted to informally marry a local enslaved man named Robert Garner, informal because the law did not recognize marriage between unfree people. Margaret's 4 children were likely fathered by both men, and her youngest surviving child, according to witnesses, looked nearly white. When she found herself pregnant with a 5th child, perhaps something inside Margaret's spirit snapped. She decided, in a state of desperation and daring, to partner with the Ohio River. On one of the coldest days on record for Kentucky, January 28th, 1856, Margaret and Robert Garner fled with all the children and Robert's parents, seeking relief from captivity. Because the river was frozen over that month, the family could cross it on foot. The Ohio had become what newspaper accounts at the time called an ice bridge or a winter bridge. The Garners were not alone in making a bid for freedom that January night. 9 other enslaved people along the Ohio also escaped in what the Chicago Tribune disparagingly called a stampede of slaves. The story had a tragic end for the Garner family. They crossed the river and reached the home of Margaret's free relatives in Ohio, but their reprieve was brutally brief. With armed officers by his side and the Fugitive Slave Act at his back, Archibald Gaines stormed the house and recaptured them. Margaret attempted to take the life of her children before allowing them to be returned to Gaines as his property. She killed the youngest child and was put on trial. The court returned Margaret Garner and her family to Archibald Gaines, who immediately sold them downriver into the Deep South. Soon after this heartbreaking episode, Philadelphia-based African-American writer, abolitionist, and feminist Frances Ellen Watkins Harper composed a poem titled The Slave Mother, A Tale of the Ohio, 1857, which describes Margaret Garner traversing a river bridged and spanned with ice. Others did make it to lasting freedom by walking the frozen river. In 1893, former U.S. President Rutherford B. Hayes told W.H. Siebert, the Ohio State University Underground Railroad historian, that in the winters of 1850, 1851, 1852, 1853, 1855, and 1856, the river was frozen over and crossing made everywhere practicable near Ripley and Cincinnati. When Hayes recited these dates, he added political context, noting that this was soon after the Fugitive Slave Law had passed. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 permitted the recapture of fugitives in the North and mandated citizen cooperation with their forcible return, while severely penalizing those who aided self-liberating Black people. The federal law sent shockwaves of fear through free Black communities, where many former captives resided, even as the law both targeted and radicalized abolitionists of all racial backgrounds. The freeze of the Ohio River for nearly 5 years straight, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, encouraged more enslaved people to escape, often in groups, at a critical moment that saw a gathering of social momentum leading up to the Civil War. We could say that the Ohio River froze throughout the 1850s entirely by chance, but there are other possibilities visible only through a lens of ecological enchantment. This wily river was my inheritance as a Black girl outdoors in the 1970s. As a Black woman writer